England did not collapse because its king lacked skill. It fell because history moved faster than any man could command. In 1066, Harold Godwinson ascended a throne surrounded by rivals, fractured loyalties, and looming threats. He was no inexperienced child or ceremonial figurehead. He was a battle-hardened commander, a shrewd diplomat, and the most influential noble in England long before the crown rested on his head. Yet in mere months, invasions came from the north and the south. His army would march relentlessly across the land, facing exhaustion, attrition, and impossible choices. Each decision, each maneuver would echo across centuries. This is not the story of one arrow or a single battlefield. It is the story of a ruler trapped by circumstance, undone by timing, whose brilliance was overshadowed by the sweep of history, and whose legacy deserves to be remembered beyond his defeat. To understand Harold II, we must first understand England on the eve of 1066. It was a prosperous and organized kingdom, yet politically fragile. No written law dictated succession. A king ruled only with the consent of powerful nobles, military might, and the church's blessing. Edward the Confessor had reigned for over 2 decades but left no heir. In his later years, power shifted decisively toward England's great noble families, most prominently the Godwins. Harold Godwinson, Edward's brother-in-law, emerged as the most influential man in the realm, respected for his leadership, military skill, and political acumen. Yet across the Channel, Duke William of Normandy claimed Edward had promised him the crown, while in Scandinavia, Harald Hardrada asserted ancient Viking rights. When Edward died, England inherited not stability but uncertainty, a throne contested by 3 men, each with armies ready to enforce their claim. Harold Godwinson was not born a king, but he was born into power. His father, Godwin of Wessex, was the most dominant noble in England. Through wealth, land, and a network of loyal supporters, the Godwin family controlled nearly half the kingdom by the time Harold came of age. From youth, Harold mastered the art of leadership. He negotiated with foreign rulers, led armies in battle, and governed territories with authority. Soldiers admired him, peers respected him, and rivals feared him. Unlike many nobles, Harold understood England as a living system. Law, land, loyalty, and military strength intertwined, each element reinforcing the other. This insight shaped a leader capable of both diplomacy and command, long before he ever wore a crown. By 1065, Harold was already England's de facto protector. Ascending the throne would not grant him power, it would make the weight of responsibility inescapable. Harold's power did not come from ceremony, it came from command. He had faced Welsh uprisings, defended England's borders, and organized regional forces with precision. Soldiers trusted him because he led from the front, shared their hardships, and understood the intricate logistics of war. His reputation was built on action, not title. Harold valued speed and decisiveness. Threats were met quickly, forces mobilized without delay, and campaigns executed with careful planning. This method had kept England relatively secure for years, but true kingship required more than battlefield skill. It required legitimacy, recognition, and the trust of nobles and clergy. When Edward the Confessor died in January 1066, Harold confronted a choice that would echo through history. Accepting the crown meant war on multiple fronts. Rejecting it risked chaos and fragmentation. Harold chose the crown, not out of ambition, but because the kingdom could not wait. England demanded leadership, and he would not hesitate. Harold was crowned king within hours of Edward's death. The speed startled Europe, but it was calculated. Any delay would give rivals time to act. The Witan, the assembly of England's nobles, backed him, and the archbishop placed the crown upon his head. By English law and tradition, his claim was unquestionable. Beyond England, however, legitimacy was a different story. William of Normandy insisted Harold had sworn an oath years earlier, promising the throne to him. In the north, Harald Hardrada of Norway believed conquest and kingship were his by right. To them, Harold was more than a king. He was an obstacle. And in the medieval world, obstacles were seldom ignored. They were removed by sword and strategy. Harold's rapid coronation secured authority at home, but it also marked him as the focal point of a storm gathering from both the north and the south, a storm that would soon engulf England entirely. Three men now claimed England. Harold ruled the kingdom, the crown settled on his head, the Witan's support behind him. Across the Channel, William of Normandy readied his fleet and armies, confident in his claim. In the north, Harald Hardrada marshaled Viking forces, intent on conquest. No alliances bridged these ambitions. No compromise could satisfy all parties. England faced not just one threat, but potentially two simultaneous invasions. Harold acted decisively. He positioned his army along the southern coast, securing key ports, fortifying defenses, and preparing for William's arrival. Months passed, supplies dwindled, tensions mounted. Yet the Norman fleet did not appear. Then a rider arrived with urgent news from the north. Harald Hardrada had landed. England was under attack. The calm of months vanished in an instant, replaced by the thunder of war. Harold's kingdom, tested by diplomacy, strategy, and loyalty, now faced the first storm of a fateful year that would change everything. Harald Hardrada arrived in northern England with a formidable Viking force, and alongside him stood Tostig, Harold's own brother. The betrayal was piercing. This was no distant incursion. It was deeply personal, a challenge not just to the crown but to family and loyalty itself. Harold made a decisive, ruthless choice. Without hesitation, he recalled his army from the south and began a march of over 200 miles, moving with unprecedented speed across England. Men and horses alike endured exhaustion, yet the urgency left no alternative. This rapid advance would deliver Harold a moment of triumph on the battlefield, demonstrating his leadership, discipline, and tactical brilliance. But every gain carried a cost. Fatigue stretched supply lines, and the looming threat from the south meant that victory in the north came at a price Harold would soon discover. A price that would shape the fate of a kingdom and echo through history. At Stamford Bridge, Harold struck with precision, catching the Viking army off guard. The clash was brutal, chaotic, and swift. Harald Hardrada fell in battle, his claim to the English crown ended forever. Beside him, Tostig, Harold's own brother and betrayer, also met his death. In a single day, the Viking threat that had loomed over the north was shattered. It was a triumph of strategy, courage, and discipline, one of the greatest battlefield victories in England's history. Yet even victory carries a cost. Harold's soldiers were spent, their bodies and morale pushed to the limit. Casualties had thinned the ranks and supplies were nearly exhausted. Before the army could recover, a grim message arrived. Across the southern coast, William of Normandy had landed. England's defenders had no time to rest. The fight for the kingdom was far from over. Harold did not pause to rest. Without hesitation, he ordered his weary army to turn south, covering hundreds of miles at a punishing pace. Wounded men pressed forward, exhaustion etched on every face. Horses stumbled under the weight of armor and supplies, yet no one faltered. Armor was repaired on the march, weapons sharpened, and morale sustained through sheer determination. Meanwhile, William of Normandy waited patiently on the southern coast. His forces were rested, well supplied, and strategically positioned, ready for the coming battle. Every detail of his preparation was deliberate, giving him an advantage Harold could not ignore. Faced with the choice between delay, risking political upheaval and giving William time to fortify, or immediate confrontation, Harold made the fateful decision. He would meet the Norman threat head-on, knowing the cost would be extreme, but that the survival of his kingdom demanded no less. On October 14, 1066, the fates of two kingdoms collided on the fields near Hastings. Harold's army took position on high ground, forming a formidable shield wall. It was a line of discipline, training, and experience, the embodiment of Anglo-Saxon military tradition. For hours the English stood firm. Wave after wave, William's Norman forces charged, yet each assault faltered against the steadfast defense. The battle raged with brutal intensity. Arrows darkened the sky. Spears clashed against shields. The air carried the cries of men, the pounding of hooves, and the unrelenting rhythm of combat. England held its ground, but fatigue set in. Confusion rippled through ranks. Messages were misread, positions wavered, and cracks began to appear in the once impenetrable line. Minute by minute, the tide shifted. The momentous struggle was not decided by one blow, one arrow, or one man. It was a test of endurance, leadership, and the relentless momentum of history itself. As the day wore on, cracks appeared in the once impenetrable shield wall. Whether through cunning feigned retreats, relentless assaults, or sheer exhaustion, Norman cavalry exploited gaps in the English line. Harold fought with ferocity, standing on foot amidst his closest retainers, his presence a rallying point for his soldiers. Every swing of sword and clash of shield spoke of his skill, courage, and unyielding resolve. But by evening the unthinkable happened. England's king fell, struck down amid the chaos of battle. With his death, the centuries-old Anglo-Saxon line of rulers came to an abrupt end. Harold had fought with every measure of his strength, wisdom, and experience. His defeat was not a failure of courage or leadership. It was the unforgiving weight of history itself, a kingdom caught between ambition, timing, and circumstance. In that moment, England's destiny irrevocably shifted, and the old world yielded to a new order. When the fighting ended at Hastings, the battlefield did not immediately decide England's fate, but it sealed it. Harold II was dead. His brothers lay among the fallen. Much of England's experienced leadership had been destroyed in a single day. Yet William had not conquered the country. He had only shattered its center. The English army did not vanish overnight. Survivors fled toward London. Nobles regrouped. For a brief moment, England still had options, but without a crowned king, unity collapsed. Decisions slowed. Authority fragmented. What Harold had provided, coordination, legitimacy, urgency, disappeared with him. William understood this instantly. Victory was meaningless unless followed by control. He did not rush north blindly. Instead, he paused, assessed, and prepared to let England's internal uncertainty do part of the work for him. In the days after Hastings, England faced a crisis deeper than invasion. The Witan, the Council of Nobles, met to decide what came next. Some proposed resistance. Others suggested negotiation. A few considered crowning a new king. Edgar Atheling, a young royal claimant, was briefly put forward. But he had no army, no authority, and no experience. The nobles who supported him could not agree on strategy. Meanwhile, William advanced carefully, securing ports and supply lines. He avoided unnecessary battles, knowing England was weakening itself. Harold's greatest strength, centralized leadership, was now absent. What remained was hesitation. The English resistance did not fail because it lacked courage. It failed because it lacked coordination. William's conquest of England was as much calculated strategy as it was brute force. He advanced methodically, punishing those who resisted and sparing those who yielded. Entire villages were razed, not in anger but as deliberate demonstration. The message was unmistakable: defy the Normans and devastation follows, cooperate and life continues. He avoided storming London directly at first. Instead, he encircled the city, severing supply lines and isolating its leaders. Hunger, fear, and uncertainty spread faster than any army. Panic became as much a weapon as swords or siege engines. This was psychological warfare, careful, precise, and terrifyingly effective. Harold would have recognized the approach. He had employed similar methods within England, using mobility, intimidation, and selective force to control his rivals. But Harold was dead. His leadership, his authority, and his ability to unify the kingdom vanished with him. Without him, England had no cohesive defense. The Normans moved through the land almost unopposed, turning strategy and patience into dominance and reshaping the country forever. In December of 1066, William was crowned King of England. The ceremony took place in Westminster Abbey, the same sacred hall where generations of English kings had taken the throne. Yet the moment was far from serene. Inside, the crowd's cheers filled the air, a mixture of awe, fear, and reluctant acceptance. Outside, Norman guards misread the sounds as rebellion. Flames ignited in nearby streets, confusion spread, and panic rippled through the city. The symbolism could not have been clearer. A new king ruled, but England itself remained unsettled. Power had shifted violently. Authority was now enforced through conquest rather than consensus. Every order from William's court carried the weight of both law and intimidation, every decision backed by armed enforcement. The Anglo-Saxon world did not vanish with a single arrow or a single battle. It ended quietly, in the uneasy tension of a coronation that marked the beginning of a new era. Harold's England was gone, replaced by a kingdom defined not by custom and loyalty, but by control, fear, and the unrelenting imposition of foreign rule. Harold II's death marked more than the end of a reign. It marked the end of an entire ruling culture. The English language would change, laws would be rewritten, land would be redistributed to foreign lords. Power would shift permanently toward Normandy. Harold's England had been centralized, pragmatic, and native. William's England would be feudal, continental, and controlled. History would remember Harold as the king who lost. But loss is not the same as failure. Harold did not lose England through weakness. He lost it because he faced impossible timing, divided loyalties, and relentless pressure, all at once. William's coronation did not end resistance, but it fractured it. Across England, local uprisings flared briefly. Towns refused taxes. Lords withheld loyalty. Some regions tested Norman authority, hoping to reclaim autonomy. But these rebellions were isolated. There was no herald to coordinate strategy, no central figure to unify timing or objectives. William exploited this weakness. He crushed resistance region by region, never allowing separate revolts to merge into a single threat. What might have become a national uprising dissolved into disconnected defiance. England still had fighters. What it lacked was leadership. This was the final consequence of Harold's death, not immediate surrender but permanent disorganization. The north of England had always been different, less controlled, more independent, harder to govern. After Hastings, northern leaders considered rebellion seriously. Distance from Norman power gave them confidence. Geography offered protection, but hope does not equal preparation. Norman forces moved faster than expected. Castles were constructed rapidly, acting as permanent military anchors. Roads were secured. Supply lines extended. The North hesitated too long. By the time resistance organized, William's presence was already entrenched. Opportunity slipped away, not because courage was lacking, but because delay proved fatal. The Normans ruled England with stone and timber. Castles appeared almost overnight. Motte and Bailey fortifications rose beside towns and rivers, dominating the landscape. These were not defensive structures alone, they were statements. Every castle announced control, every tower watched movement, every garrison enforced loyalty. Where Anglo-Saxon rule relied on consensus and custom, Norman rule relied on permanence and pressure. Harold's England had no equivalent system. William understood something critical. Control the land physically, and resistance becomes impossible. England was being reshaped, not culturally yet but structurally. William did not destroy English law, he reshaped it. To maintain order, he preserved many existing legal customs, while quietly shifting authority into Norman hands. Sheriffs reported to Norman lords. Courts enforced Norman interests. Land ownership became conditional on loyalty. The system looked familiar to the English, but it now served different masters. This subtle transformation prevented mass rebellion. People recognized the process, even if outcomes changed. Harold had ruled through tradition. William ruled through adaptation. And adaptation proved more effective than force alone. William never ruled England as Harold had. He ruled as a conqueror who feared instability. Every rebellion reinforced his caution. Every rumor hardened his grip. Where Harold had relied on trust and obligation, William relied on surveillance and enforcement. This difference mattered. England became quieter, but not calmer. Order returned, but tension remained beneath the surface. The kingdom had survived invasion, but lost its voice. And Harold's shadow lingered, not as a rival, but as a reminder of what England had been before 1066. After conquest comes a quieter battle, the fight over memory. William controlled the crown, the land, and eventually the story. Norman clerks rewrote England's recent past, framing Harold not as a rightful king, but as a usurper who broke a sacred oath. This narrative mattered. If Harold was illegitimate, then William's invasion became justice, not aggression. Very few English voices survived in written form. Monasteries fell under Norman oversight. Chroniclers adjusted language carefully, choosing words that justified the present. History was not erased, it was redirected. Harold's defeat did not end his story. It changed who was allowed to tell it. The most famous image of 1066 is not a document, but a tapestry. The Bayeux Tapestry tells the Norman version of events, stitched with precision and intent. Harold appears ambitious, oath-breaking, and doomed. William appears chosen. Every scene reinforces legitimacy. Every detail supports conquest. But the tapestry omits uncertainty. It ignores English law. It simplifies complex politics into moral theater. This was storytelling with a purpose. For centuries, this single visual narrative shaped how Europe remembered Harold II. The conqueror did not just win England, he framed its past. What makes Harold's story haunting is not mystery, it is absence. Most English voices were never written down, and those that survived were altered, rewritten, or lost over time. Oral traditions faded, local memories vanished, and the people who had followed Harold left no grand monuments to mark their loyalty. No triumphant songs echoed through the centuries. What remains are fragments, scattered chronicles, biased accounts, and traces uncovered by archaeology. Silence itself became a part of the conquest, shaping the story as much as sword and shield. History has a way of favoring those who record it, those who survive in text and memory. By that measure, Harold's England lost its voice. His deeds, his leadership, and the resilience of his kingdom are glimpsed only in echoes, hints, and the gaps between lines of surviving accounts. And yet, even in absence, the weight of Harold's life and the drama of 1066 continues to resonate. By the measure of outcome, Harold failed, but judged by circumstance, his reign was nothing short of extraordinary. He faced invasions from two directions, each threatening to crush England simultaneously. He mobilized faster than any king before him, marching armies hundreds of miles at breakneck speed. He fought with relentless determination, leading from the front and inspiring loyalty in men stretched to their limits. Harold did not lose England because he lacked skill, courage, or leadership. He lost it to exhaustion, the unforgiving constraints of timing, and a single, decisive battle that shifted the course of history. Modern historians increasingly view Harold not as a failed pretender, but as a competent and capable ruler trapped in an impossible situation. His story reminds us that history often hinges not on character alone, but on circumstance, chance, and the cruel calculus of fate. Harold II stands at the threshold of two worlds. Behind him lay Anglo-Saxon England, a realm shaped by consensus, custom, and local loyalties. Ahead waited Norman England, forged in the image of castles, hierarchy, and centralized authority. His reign was brief, yet its significance was immense. Harold did not shape the centuries to come. He marked the closing of an era. The traditions, freedoms, and systems that had defined Anglo-Saxon life began to vanish the moment he fell. Harold's true importance is not measured in years on the throne, but in what disappeared with him: the end of an old order, the loss of familiar ways, and the dawn of a new, foreign rule. 1066 was more than a battle. It was a turning point, a transformation in the very fabric of England. And Harold, for all his skill and courage, was caught at the eye of that historical storm. The battle was over, but England's struggle had only begun. For ordinary people, 1066 was not a date, it was a disruption. Lords were replaced, laws were reinterpreted, languages shifted overnight. Anglo-Saxon elites vanished from power, replaced by Norman rulers who spoke French and ruled from fortified castles. Villages felt the change immediately. New taxes were imposed. Land was redistributed. Old agreements meant nothing. Harold's death did not just remove a king, it shattered a system that had governed daily life for generations. For peasants and townsfolk, survival mattered more than loyalty. Adaptation became necessary. History remembers kings, but transformation begins with farmers, craftsmen, and families adjusting to a new reality. The Norman Conquest did not announce itself with speeches or reconciliation. It arrived in timber, earth, and shadow. Across England, castles rose with unsettling speed. Wooden towers crowned artificial hills, looming over roads, markets, and rivers. These structures were more than military defenses. They were declarations, authority carved into the skyline. From behind their walls, Norman lords governed with distance and dominance. Taxes were enforced, resistance was silenced, and loyalty was no longer requested. It was demanded. The castle became the center of power, watching every village below. For the English people, these fortresses carried a clear message. The world they knew had ended. Where Harold's England had depended on oath, reputation, and shared custom, William's rule relied on height, stone, and separation. The conquest did not just replace a king. It reshaped the land itself, turning geography into a tool of control, and England into a country forever changed by what now towered above it. The transformation did not end with crowns or castles. It reached deeper into law, language, and memory. Old English laws were not erased, but they were filtered through foreign hands. Norman judges interpreted them differently. Courtrooms echoed with French, while Latin locked decisions into records few locals could read. Justice still existed, but it no longer felt familiar. For ordinary people, authority became distant, abstract, and harder to challenge. Names began to vanish. Anglo-Saxon families slipped out of official documents, replaced by unfamiliar titles and imported lineages. Power did not need mass violence to succeed. It used administration. This was not annihilation. It was replacement, a slow narrowing of space, influence, and voice, executed through paperwork rather than blades. Harold's England was not destroyed in a single moment. It dimmed gradually, overwritten entry by entry, until what remained felt like memory rather than rule. Harold's fall did not end resistance. It only stripped it of a center. Across England, defiance flickered, especially in the north. Local leaders rose. Danish fleets appeared on the horizon once more. For a moment, it seemed the conquest might still unravel, but rebellion without unity is fragile. There was no king to coordinate strategy, no single voice to bind villages and earls into one cause. Each uprising stood alone and fell alone. William answered uncertainty with terror. His campaign in the north was deliberate and ruthless. Fields were emptied, livestock destroyed, settlements erased not for victory but for warning. Hunger followed where armies did not need to stay. The lesson spread faster than soldiers ever could. Opposition would be remembered. Submission would be allowed. England did not surrender all at once. It learned piece by piece that survival now depended on silence. By the early 1070s, the change was no longer in motion. It was finished. England still existed in name, in villages, in fields and churches. But the world that had shaped it for generations had slipped away. Power now spoke with a Norman accent. Land passed into foreign hands. Customs blended, sometimes uneasily, into something unfamiliar. The Anglo-Saxon past did not vanish in flames. It dissolved quietly. Harold II survived only in fragments, local memory, half-remembered loyalties, and stories spoken carefully. His reign closed a chapter written in shared rule, oath-bound leadership, and ancient tradition. What replaced it was not chaos. It was structure. A new England emerged, tighter, harsher, more centralized. Castles, records, and hierarchy reshaped daily life. Authority became visible, permanent, and imposed. This was not merely conquest. It was reinvention. An island reborn not by choice, but by consequence, carrying the shadow of defeat into a future it never asked for. After 1066, Harold II did not become a legend. He became an absence. Norman chroniclers had no interest in honoring a defeated king. English voices were muted, displaced, or rewritten. Official records moved on quickly, as if Harold had been an inconvenient interruption rather than England's last native ruler. No grand tomb marked his resting place. No royal cult preserved his memory. Silence settled where remembrance should have been. Yet memory does not disappear, it retreats. Among common people, stories lingered, quiet references, half-remembered songs, a sense that something rightful had been lost. Harold became a king remembered without monuments, a ruler erased by power, not time. After 1066, England's story was no longer told by those who lost. It was written by the victors, carefully, deliberately in Norman ink. William's triumph was presented as fate fulfilled. Harold became a warning, portrayed as impulsive, unlawful, already doomed. Defeat was made to look inevitable so conquest could appear justified. The Bayeux Tapestry reflects this vision. Harold is everywhere, yet never commanding events, never mastering them. Each scene nudges him closer to collapse, as if history itself had already passed judgment. That framing was not accidental. Controlling memory meant securing authority. If Harold was shown as unworthy, then resistance itself seemed pointless. England, the message implied, could not have endured without Norman rule, but narratives crafted so tightly often hide unease. Power rewrites the past when it fears alternative versions might survive. When memory itself becomes dangerous, it must be reshaped. What remains is not just history, but a warning about who gets to tell it and why. Official records pushed Harold aside, but memory does not live only in ink. Among the people, a different version endured. In village tales and quiet retellings, Harold was remembered as the king who remained. Not flawless, not victorious, but there standing his ground when everything collapsed around him. He did not escape the field. He did not abandon his army. He fell where his men stood, sharing their fate. For a conquered land, that detail mattered more than crowns or claims. Harold became a symbol not of success but of defiance. And defiance, even in defeat, can take root where victory cannot. These stories were never sanctioned. They were never carved into stone or stitched into banners. They survived in voices, spoken softly, carried carefully from one generation to the next. A memory kept alive not because power allowed it, but because the people needed it to endure. Unlike William, Harold left no throne to inherit, no crowned sons, no bloodline to guard his memory, no court to retell his victories. In the medieval world, legacy depended on lineage. Kings were remembered because their heirs made sure they were. Harold had none to do that work for him. His family was stripped of land and influence. Their voices faded under Norman rule. Silence was not accidental, it was imposed. Harold's death ended more than a life. It ended a political future. Yet absence reshaped his legacy in an unexpected way. With no dynasty to defend him, Harold slipped free from propaganda and courtly praise. He stopped being a ruler measured by success or failure. He became an idea, a final English king, a stand taken, not a crown secured, a moment frozen at the edge of transformation. Names fade, titles vanish, but symbols survive because they belong to memory, not power. Centuries passed before the silence began to crack. When scholars returned to 1066, they stopped asking who conquered England and started asking what England lost. In that reevaluation, Harold II reappeared, not as a cautionary tale, but as a human being caught inside a collapsing moment. He did not fail because he misunderstood power. He failed because power demanded everything at once. Loyalty pulled him north. Duty held him south. Time refused to wait. No ruler could have answered all three without breaking something. Harold's story is not about poor judgment. It is about narrowing choices. Three claimants, one throne, one year that allowed no second chances. In that sense, 1066 was not the exposure of Harold's flaws. It was the fracture of an entire system, and England pushed past its limits. And as modern history softened its verdict, Harold's image shifted too. No longer a defeated king, but a man remembered for standing, even when standing was no longer enough. Harold II was not undone by inexperience. He was tested by extremes. In the space of a single season, he confronted two invasions no English king had ever faced back-to-back. When the Norwegian fleet struck in the north, Harold reacted with breathtaking speed, summoning the Field and driving his army across the length of the country. At Stamford Bridge, he shattered Hardrada's forces in a brutal, decisive clash that erased the Viking threat in a single day. It was a commander's victory, precise, aggressive, and complete. But war does not reset after triumph. Men fell, supplies vanished, marches continued. Bodies carried fatigue even as banners were raised again. Before wounds could close, Harold was forced south, toward another enemy already waiting. At Hastings, he stood with soldiers who had already given everything once. His planning was disciplined, his instincts proven, his authority unquestioned. What failed him was not judgment, but time. And time in 1066 showed no mercy. The year 1066 offered no mercy. Harold's crown had barely settled when England began to fracture under pressure from opposite horizons. Danger rose in the north, demanding immediate action. At the same time, the southern coast loomed vulnerable, exposed to an enemy waiting for the moment Harold turned away. The kingdom had strength, but not enough to face everything at once. Every choice narrowed his options. March north and the south lay open. Guard the coast and the north would burn. England's roads were long, its armies temporary, its resources finite. There was no reserve force waiting in silence. Each march drained men, horses, and morale. The strain was relentless. Soldiers carried wounds that never healed. Nobles felt the weight of uncertainty. Messengers brought news faster than armies could move. This was not a test of bravery. Harold had that in abundance. It was a test of limits. England's geography, timing, and divided threats created a trap with no clean escape. Harold was not navigating strategy alone. He was fighting distance, exhaustion, and the unforgiving mathematics of war. Some years decide history. 1066 consumed it. Harold's triumph at Stamford Bridge was brilliant, but it came at a steep price. The Viking army was annihilated, Hardrada and Tostig lay dead, and England's northern threat was ended in a single day. Yet the cost was immediate and severe. Soldiers were battered, weapons worn, armor broken. Wounds festered as exhaustion seeped into every unit. Victory had demanded everything Harold could muster, and left little in reserve. By the time William of Normandy touched English soil, Harold faced a new reality. There was no time to fully recover, no opportunity to train reinforcements, and no margin for error. His battle-hardened veterans carried fatigue alongside their courage. Supply lines stretched thin. Morale, once high from victory, now teetered under relentless marching and the knowledge of another massive confrontation. Harold had proven his skill as a commander. He had struck decisively. But in 1066, speed and endurance mattered as much as strategy. Stamford Bridge was a victory, and simultaneously the opening chapter of England's final trial under Harold's leadership. Immediately after Stamford Bridge, Harold ordered his army south, covering hundreds of miles in a matter of days, a feat that astonished both contemporaries and later historians. Every step, every forced march tested men and horses to the brink. Wounds reopened. Armor and weapons suffered. Fatigue became a constant companion. Meanwhile, William of Normandy arrived in the south with a rested, well-equipped force, complete with cavalry and archers ready for a decisive engagement. Harold reached Hastings determined and unwavering, but his soldiers were stretched thin, cohesion fraying under relentless pressure, and supply lines strained to breaking. Harold's choices were rational. Pausing would have allowed William to entrench, to gather reinforcements, and to dictate the battlefield. Yet reason could not erase exhaustion, nor could strategy overcome the brutal realities of physical limits and timing. The march remains legendary, not for triumph, but for the sheer audacity of moving an army at the edge of human endurance, a testament to Harold's resolve in a year that allowed no rest. In the days before Hastings, Harold reorganized his forces. Defensive positions were chosen, shield walls prepared, and leadership assigned. He anticipated William's tactics, foreseeing cavalry charges and archery. Despite careful planning, the army was strained. Many men were local levies, untested in prolonged campaigns. Weapons were repaired hastily, reinforcements were limited. Morale wavered under pressure, uncertainty, and weariness. Harold's leadership shone in these final hours. He inspected troops, encouraged commanders, and reinforced defensive formations. Yet he knew that even the best preparations could not erase the gap between theory and battlefield reality. Hastings was not lost because Harold was weak. It was lost because circumstance, timing, and relentless opposition converged in one moment. October 14, 1066. Senlac Hill became the stage for England's fate. Harold's army, almost entirely infantry, formed a tight, disciplined shield wall along the ridge. They were veterans of battle, yet exhaustion weighed on every man, each step heavy with months of campaigning. Behind their shields, tension simmered. Every soldier knew what was at stake: the crown, the kingdom, the future of England itself. Across the field, William's Norman forces waited, rested, and strategically arranged. Cavalry, archers, and infantry combined in a coordinated web of movement, ready to exploit any opening. Mobility, deception, and timing were their weapons, as opposed to the English reliance on steadfast discipline and positioning. On that ridge, strategy met endurance. Every arrow loosed, every charge launched, tested not just skill, but stamina and resolve. Hills slowed the Normans, shield walls resisted, but cracks began to form under relentless pressure. Harold's presence gave courage. William's composure exuded control. The battlefield held its breath. Moments like these were where kings were forged or forgotten. The first clash would decide everything, and neither side could predict who history would remember. Harold's shield wall held firm against the first waves of Norman assault. Horses slammed into wooden defenses, only to recoil against the steadfast line of spears. Arrows rained down, many bouncing harmlessly off the tightly interlocked shields. English foot soldiers pressed forward, disciplined and unyielding, trusting both their own training and the man at their side. For hours, the Normans struggled to find a weakness, each failed charge costing lives and morale. This was Harold's advantage: cohesion, experience, and unshakable discipline. His men moved as one, a wall of steel and resolve. Yet the battle was not static. William's tactics began to chip away subtly. Feigned retreats lured some English soldiers from their positions. Gaps appeared where the shield wall had once seemed impenetrable. Momentum shifted, slowly, imperceptibly, strategically. The ridge itself became a weapon and a constraint. Every arrow loosed, Every footstep on uneven ground could decide victory or defeat. Harold's strength met William's cunning, endurance faced strategy, and the fate of England balanced on every tense, perilous moment of the day. William's genius was patience. The feigned retreat, a tactical ruse, lured English fighters from the shield wall. Young, eager, and overconfident soldiers chased retreating Normans down the slope. Once isolated, they were cut down by cavalry or archers. These minor breaches accumulated. Small openings widened. Confidence wavered. Harold saw this unfolding. He attempted to rally his men, holding the line as best he could. But fatigue, confusion, and uneven engagement took their toll. The shield wall could no longer function as a single, unbroken unit. By exploiting human instinct, the desire to strike a fleeing enemy, William destabilized the very foundation of English defense. Harold moved relentlessly through the heart of the battle, a figure of command and courage. He reinforced weak points in the shield wall, urged men forward, and inspired those whose resolve faltered under the relentless Norman assault. His presence was both rallying point and symbol, England's last anchor on Senlac Hill. Then, in a moment that would echo through history, an arrow or perhaps a cluster of blows struck him. Some accounts say it pierced his eye. Others suggest he fell amidst the chaos of combat. The precise moment matters less than the consequence. England's king was gone. Instantly, command fractured. Soldiers who had followed him without question wavered. Discipline broke. Confidence collapsed. The shield wall, once unyielding, splintered under pressure. Small groups fought with desperate valor, but without coordination or leadership, resistance fragmented into isolated pockets. Hastings was lost not through a single clever move or failure, but through a relentless collision of exhaustion, timing, and the unforgiving weight of circumstance. The death of Harold II marked not just a battlefield defeat, but the end of an era. The battle ended. The fields of Senlac were littered with the dead and dying. England's nobility lay shattered. Families once powerful were erased from the political map. Harold's body disappeared into legend, leaving only questions and stories. William's victory was absolute, yet the cost of triumph extended far beyond corpses. The old order of England had crumbled. Government, law, and succession were thrown into chaos. Common people endured the shock of devastation, witnessing the collapse of a world they had long taken for granted. Authority would now be enforced by Norman castles, by sheriffs who answered to a foreign crown, and by sweeping redistribution of lands. Compliance was demanded, adaptation was survival, and resistance met annihilation. Harold's death became more than a military loss. It marked the end of Anglo-Saxon independence and the beginning of a profound cultural transformation. Hastings is remembered not only as a clash of armies, but as a study in leadership, timing, and fate. A king whose courage was unmatched, yet whose circumstances were insurmountable, shaping the course of English and European history forever. After Hastings, William acted with ruthless efficiency. The southern shires nearest to his landing were brought under control almost immediately. Towns surrendered when faced with his disciplined forces, while others were forced into compliance. Norman knights garrisoned key towns and fortresses, their presence both a deterrent and a declaration. The old order had ended. Local lords were given a stark choice: pledge loyalty or be replaced, their lands redistributed to trusted followers. Every road, river crossing, and bridge was monitored, allowing rapid movement of troops and communication across the newly conquered region. Markets, trade routes, and resources were taxed to sustain the occupation. turning administration into a weapon as effective as any sword. For ordinary English people, the transformation was immediate and tangible. Daily life, once governed by local custom and communal trust, now answered to foreign authority. Fear replaced security. Familiar leaders vanished, and the crown's reach extended into every village and town. Harold's England, a kingdom shaped by negotiation, oaths, and consensus, was gone, replaced by a system of control defined by castles, mounted knights, and unyielding authority. Norman authority was built as much from stone as from soldiers. Across southern England, motte and bailey castles sprouted with remarkable speed, each more than a fortification. They were centers of power, administration, and control. From their wooden and later stone heights, lords and sheriffs could oversee villages, enforce laws, and remind the population who now held dominion. These fortresses were silent enforcers. Fields were worked under watchful eyes, local disputes reported to Norman officials, and any hint of defiance met swift response. The physical landscape itself became a mechanism of governance, reshaping England as much as any army. Harold's rule had depended on consensus, oaths, and loyalty earned over time. William's rule depended on infrastructure, visibility, and intimidation. Every castle, every garrison, every road monitored created a network of authority that left no question of power. For ordinary Englishmen, the horizon was now dominated by timber and stone, a constant reminder. The old kingdom was gone, replaced by a new order built on architecture, administration, and unyielding control. William reshaped England not just through battles but through land and loyalty. Anglo-Saxon nobles, once the backbone of regional authority, were stripped of estates, wealth, and influence. Their lands flowed to Norman knights, carefully selected for allegiance and martial skill. Resistance was punished swiftly, compliance was rewarded generously. This redistribution was both practical and psychological. By planting loyal men across the kingdom, William created a network of vested interests, each responsible for maintaining control over their new territories. The promise of reward encouraged obedience. The threat of removal or exile instilled caution. Power now depended on personal loyalty to the crown rather than inherited privilege or local tradition. For the surviving English elite, options were limited. Some became vassals under Norman lords, adapting to survive. Others fled or faded into obscurity. Local governance transformed almost overnight. Harold's England, grounded in consensus, custom, and negotiated authority, was replaced by a hierarchical system. Land, service, and loyalty formed the pillars of rule. In a single generation, the social and political landscape of England was irrevocably altered. William retained fragments of Anglo-Saxon law, not out of nostalgia, but strategy. By keeping familiar legal practices, he reduced the risk of rebellion, giving the population a sense of continuity even as the machinery of power shifted. Norman sheriffs now enforced justice, but interpretation favored the crown and its loyal followers. Local courts persisted, yet their rulings were framed within the new hierarchy, ensuring that authority flowed upward rather than outward. This careful mixture of tradition and innovation stabilized the kingdom. Superficial customs remained visible, but real governance operated under Norman control. Taxes, fines, and disputes were now tools to reinforce loyalty, not just maintain order. The familiar rhythms of English life persisted, but the underlying system had been rewritten. Harold's England relied on consensus, oaths, and reciprocal trust between king and nobles. William's England relied on oversight, reporting, and centralized authority. Ordinary people adapted, some reluctantly, some pragmatically, navigating the new structures to survive. In this quiet transformation, the old England faded while the foundations of a new political and social order were cemented, reshaping the nation for generations. For ordinary people, survival became the highest priority. Peasants labored in fields, paid taxes, and obeyed new lords. Townsfolk navigated markets now regulated by Norman authorities, where every transaction, toll, and inspection reinforced the presence of the conquerors. Fear and practicality replaced loyalty. Compliance was a necessity, not choice. Yet not everything vanished. Quiet traditions, harvest celebrations, local rituals, and the stories passed from one generation to the next continued under the radar. These small acts preserved fragments of a world that had existed for centuries, even as the framework of authority shifted completely. England was no longer guided by native kings or communal consensus. Power flowed from fortified castles, vigilant sheriffs, and the strict logic of Norman law. Harold II's era had ended, leaving behind a kingdom transformed. Nobles were displaced, customs reshaped, and the political landscape rewritten. The conquest extended far beyond battlefields. It was administrative, cultural, and psychological. Harold's memory lingered quietly, but the England he knew had disappeared, replaced by a kingdom permanently altered in structure, governance, and identity. Harold's death and William's conquest transformed more than politics. They remade identity itself. The Anglo-Saxon world, once dominant, was now subdued. Language, customs, and traditions survived, but their influence was diminished. French became the tongue of power, while Latin commanded law and church alike. For ordinary people, life went on, yet the frameworks of authority had shifted dramatically. Power was no longer local, familiar, or negotiated. Loyalty flowed to distant Norman rulers rather than kin networks or community councils. Harold's England, built on consensus, oaths, and shared memory, faded from official records. Still, resistance endured quietly. Stories, songs, and private traditions preserved a sense of continuity. Memory became personal, woven into daily life and whispered across generations. The people adapted, blending survival with subtle defiance, carrying fragments of their past into a kingdom increasingly shaped by foreign hands. Harold's legacy, though erased from power, lived on in these silent acts, proof that culture and identity cannot be conquered entirely, only transformed. William preserved select Anglo-Saxon customs, but the kingdom's legal and administrative landscape was profoundly transformed. Norman sheriffs implemented new tax systems, redistributed land, and standardized fines, all under the crown's direct oversight. Local disputes no longer depended on personal relationships or negotiated settlements. Courts still functioned, but decisions now reflected Norman priorities and the authority of the conqueror. English lords lost much of the autonomy they had exercised under Harold. Consensus and traditional oaths gave way to a structured, top-down hierarchy. For ordinary people, law became clearer, more consistent, but also impersonal. Survival relied on obedience rather than negotiation, and local influence mattered less than ever. Authority flowed from castles, sheriffs, and distant officials instead of communal trust or inherited power. William's reforms brought order and stability, but they reshaped English society at its core. What had once been a system rooted in shared responsibility and memory now emphasized control, hierarchy, and centralized power. The kingdom endured, but the world herald had defended vanished beneath Norman rule. The very landscape of England came under Norman control. Castles sprang up in strategic locations, reshaping towns, trade routes, and the countryside itself. Timber Motte Bailey fortresses and stone keeps replaced Anglo-Saxon halls, dominating skylines and asserting authority in every region. These constructions were far more than defensive structures. They were administrative hubs, symbols of power, and instruments of governance. Villages, markets, and farmland now operated under their watchful presence. Roads, bridges, and river crossings were monitored to control movement, supply, and communication. The land itself became a tool of authority. Harold's England had thrived on decentralized leadership, local loyalty, and shared custom. William's regime relied on infrastructure, surveillance, and architectural dominance. Every castle, every fortified manor, every garrison was a deliberate statement. Rebellion would not be tolerated. By transforming the physical environment, the Normans made control tangible. Power was no longer just a concept. It was seen, felt, and impossible to ignore. England's landscape became a map of conquest, order, and permanent change. While official records celebrated William, the common people remembered Harold differently. Across villages and towns, his story survived in whispers, songs, and local legends. A king who stood, fought, and died defending his homeland. These accounts were rarely written, yet they shaped cultural memory. Harold became more than a fallen monarch. He became a symbol of defiance, the embodiment of the last truly Anglo-Saxon England. His courage, his leadership, and his struggle were preserved in ways that official chronicles could not erase. Even as Norman authority dominated politics and law, Harold lived on in the hearts of the people. Oral traditions carried his memory through generations, teaching lessons about loyalty, bravery, and the fragility of freedom. Communities clung to these stories, subtly resisting the erasure of their past. In this quiet way, Harold's legacy endured, not through monuments or crowns, but through memory itself, reminding England that conquest could change rulers, but it could never fully erase identity, pride, or the stories that bind a people to their land. Survival demanded adaptation. English peasants, townspeople, and minor nobles had to navigate a world ruled by Norman lords. Daily life revolved around new taxes, unfamiliar laws, and foreign authorities, transforming routines once guided by local custom and trust. Yet culture proved resilient. Festivals, harvest rituals, and community traditions persisted, sometimes quietly, sometimes hidden from the eyes of conquerors. Harold's England may have vanished from official records, but its spirit endured in speech, local practices, and collective memory. Ordinary people carried fragments of their past into the new order, preserving identity through subtle resistance and continuity. The kingdom had changed irrevocably, yet it remained alive in its people. Survival was not mere obedience. It was negotiation, compromise, and the careful maintenance of what mattered most. In these everyday acts, Harold's legacy lingered, a reminder that a ruler's reign may end, but the culture, memory, and resilience of a people can endure far longer than conquest itself. After Hastings, William acted swiftly, reshaping southern England with a network of castles built at astonishing speed. Motte Bailey fortresses rose on hills, river crossings, and strategic towns, each serving as more than a military post. They were symbols of power, asserting the crown's dominance over land and people. For local communities, these imposing structures were impossible to ignore. Villages and marketplaces operated under their shadow, subjected to Norman taxation, oversight, and the constant presence of armed garrisons. Uprisings were swiftly quelled. Any hint of rebellion met immediate, visible response. Where Harold had relied on consensus, trust, and local loyalty, William relied on architecture and intimidation. These castles were more than stone and timber. They were instruments of governance. They projected authority, enforced law, and reminded the population that the old order was gone. By combining strategy, engineering, and political foresight, William ensured that power was both omnipresent and unchallengeable, turning England into a kingdom defined as much by its fortresses as by its rulers. Norman rule reshaped England not just through conquest, but through a tightly controlled administrative system. William installed sheriffs loyal to him in place of Anglo-Saxon thanes, granting them sweeping powers to collect taxes, enforce laws, and oversee local governance, all while reporting directly to the crown. Authority no longer trickled up from tradition or local consensus. It radiated outward from castles and Norman officials, creating a centralized chain of command. Local courts continued to function, but justice was filtered through Norman priorities. Surviving English lords saw their influence shrink, their traditional roles replaced by men whose loyalty lay entirely with William. Every decree, every collection of dues, every judgment reinforced the dominance of the new order. This system was ruthless in its efficiency. Harold's England had depended on personal bonds, oaths, and regional cooperation. William's England relied on structure, hierarchy, and accountability to the crown. For ordinary people, life became predictable yet impersonal, governed by distant authority rather than neighborly trust. Yet in its strictness, this administration brought stability, preventing rebellion from spreading and ensuring that conquest became permanent, not fleeting. William confiscated Anglo-Saxon lands and granted them to loyal Norman knights. Wealth, titles, and influence shifted overnight. This was strategic. It incentivized loyalty, created vested interests, and punished resistance. Former English nobles either adapted as subordinates, fled, or lost everything. The redistribution reshaped the social hierarchy. Authority depended not on inherited rights but on service to the crown. Harold's governance, based on local knowledge and alliances, vanished. Instead, feudal bonds replaced communal ties. This change was more than political. It restructured English society, economy, and identity. The conquest was complete, not only on the battlefield but in daily life. Norman control relied on finance as much as force. Taxes were standardized, ensuring predictable revenue for the crown and its administrators. Markets, trade, and villages were now under watchful eyes, generating wealth to sustain castles, garrisons, and the royal court. Coins, tolls, and levies became tools of governance. Harold's England had relied on customary obligations. William's England relied on written records, surveys, and regular collection. The Doomsday Book, compiled later, was the culmination of this approach. Knowledge as power. Economic control reinforced political stability. Compliance became necessary not just for survival but for participation in commerce and society. Harold's world, governed by trust and custom, had been replaced by a system of accountability, surveillance, and centralized authority. The conquest reshaped culture. French became the language of the court. Latin dominated official documents. Norman customs influenced art, architecture, and law. English traditions persisted but were layered beneath foreign influence. Peasants and townspeople adapted. Festivals, crafts, and local life continued, but authority was unmistakably Norman. Harold's memory survived only in private stories and oral traditions. The kingdom had changed irreversibly. Harold II's brief reign symbolized the end of native kingship. Yet English identity endured, resilient beneath the structures, languages, and laws imposed by Norman rule. This duality, submission to authority while preserving heritage, would define English society for centuries. Even after the conquest, Harold II lived on in English memory. Though official records favored William, bards, storytellers, and villagers kept his tale alive. Songs recounted his bravery, the last stand of the Shield Wall, and the dramatic fall at Hastings. These oral histories preserved identity and cultural pride. Harold became a symbol of resistance, courage, and the lost independence of Anglo-Saxon England. Stories varied by region. Some glorified him as a hero, others warned of the dangers of overconfidence and divided leadership, but all reinforced a shared memory of England before the Normans. The persistence of Harold's story highlights a crucial aspect of history. Even when rulers fall, narratives survive. Memory becomes a tool of identity, shaping how people understood themselves and their connection to the land. Norman rule reshaped culture, but not entirely. English traditions survived quietly, blending with French and Norman influences. Architecture fused timber and stone, language incorporated French words into Old English, and legal systems merged customary law with Norman feudal codes. Harold's death marked the end of Anglo-Saxon political independence, but the people adapted, weaving old practices into new frameworks. Markets, festivals, and community rituals endured, subtly preserving continuity in daily life. This cultural blending demonstrates resilience. England did not vanish under conquest. It evolved. Norman and English elements intertwined to form the foundation of medieval English identity, a hybrid culture shaped by both disruption and adaptation. Monasteries and churches adjusted to the new order. Norman abbots replaced Anglo-Saxon leaders, yet monastic life continued to educate, preserve manuscripts, and maintain spiritual guidance. English monks often stayed, passing knowledge to a generation growing under Norman rule. Christian festivals persisted, blending Norman liturgical practices with local traditions. Harold's era had emphasized local bishops and community faith. William centralized ecclesiastical authority, linking it closely to the crown. This shift reinforced political control, but did not extinguish spiritual life. The church became both a tool of governance and a protector of cultural memory, preserving English traditions quietly within its walls. Resistance persisted subtly. Some English nobles plotted, others fled. Peasants occasionally resisted through slow compliance or refusal to pay taxes. These acts were minor but symbolically significant, preserving autonomy in a constrained environment. At the same time, many adapted. Survival depended on understanding the new hierarchy, cooperating with Norman officials, and blending old customs with imposed regulations. Communities learned to navigate the tension between authority and tradition. Harold's memory inspired resilience, reminding people that leadership, courage, and identity persisted even under foreign rule. This quiet resistance ensured that Anglo-Saxon culture remained a living thread woven into the fabric of Norman England. By the mid-1070s, England was transformed, yet Harold's influence lingered in memory, culture, and cautionary tales. His brief reign demonstrated leadership under extreme pressure. Rapid military mobilization, decisive strategy, and the human limits of endurance. Norman rule reshaped institutions, land ownership, and law, but it did not erase English identity. Instead, a hybrid culture emerged, blending Anglo-Saxon resilience with Norman structures. Harold II's story endures as a lesson. Leadership, courage, and memory can persist long after political power fades. Hastings was a decisive battle, but it did not erase the values, traditions, and identity of the people Harold led. Even centuries later, he remains a symbol of the last independent Anglo-Saxon king, remembered for bravery, strategy, and the tragic circumstances that defined 1066. In 1085, nearly 20 years after Hastings, William commissioned the Domesday Survey, a massive record of land holdings, resources, and population across England. This project reflected the culmination of his systematic control over the kingdom. The survey documented every manor, field, mill, and peasant, creating an unparalleled administrative snapshot. William's officials traveled far and wide, recording information directly from local leaders. Anglo-Saxon nobles who remained were scrutinized. Norman knights had their holdings confirmed. This record was more than bureaucracy. It was a tool of power. With precise knowledge, William could levy taxes accurately, prevent rebellion, and allocate resources efficiently. Harold's England, where trust and local authority dominated, had given way to a system based on surveillance, data, and centralized governance. The Domesday Survey transformed the relationship between ruler and subject. Taxes became predictable, tied directly to documented land and resources. Norman sheriffs ensured compliance, collecting levies and reporting to the crown. Peasants and townspeople now operated under a system that emphasized accountability over custom. Harold's reliance on consensus and inherited obligations was replaced by formalized obligations. The survey also reinforced feudal structures. Loyal knights were rewarded with estates. Loyal subjects had clear expectations. The balance of power was no longer local or negotiated. It was codified. England had become a state where knowledge equaled control, and data itself was a weapon. Norman governance reshaped daily existence. Markets now operated under Norman oversight. Tolls and taxes were enforced, and traditional village councils had diminished power. Churches and monasteries followed Norman bishops. Education shifted slightly, emphasizing Latin and continental scholarship. Festivals and rituals adapted to new rulers, blending local customs with imported practices. Life continued, but authority had a visible, pervasive presence. Harold's England had relied on personal relationships and local consensus. Now obedience and hierarchy defined society. Yet, English culture persisted quietly. Songs, crafts, and community traditions endured, blending subtly with Norman influence. Subtle resistance persisted. Some English nobles plotted rebellion, others fled to Wales or Scandinavia. Minor uprisings occurred but were swiftly crushed by Norman garrisons. For the majority, adaptation was survival. Accepting Norman authority allowed continuity in farming, trade, and community life. Customs and folklore preserved memory of Harold II and the Anglo-Saxon past. This balance of control and resilience illustrates the duality of conquest. Dominance reshaped structures, but identity endured. England's population adjusted to survive while maintaining continuity with their heritage, showing the interplay between imposed power and cultural persistence. Even as Norman authority became entrenched, Harold II's legacy persisted. He remained the last native king, the final embodiment of Anglo-Saxon independence. His story informed resistance, memory, and identity. Families passed down tales of his bravery. Bards sang of Hastings long after it was over. These narratives shaped how future generations understood kingship, loyalty, and English identity. Norman governance, infrastructure, and law were permanent, but Harold's memory provided a cultural anchor, a reminder of what England had been, and a symbol of resilience amid profound change. After Hastings, English chroniclers began recording events with urgency. Works like the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle documented Harold's life, battle, and death in vivid detail. These texts preserved not only facts but sentiment, often portraying Harold as the last hope of Anglo-Saxon independence. Chroniclers balanced loyalty and survival. They could not openly oppose Norman authority, yet they recorded events for posterity. The stories highlight his bravery, strategic decisions, and tragic fall. This written memory ensured that Harold II remained central in England's historical imagination. While Norman records focused on William's triumph, the English narratives offered a counterpoint, a reflection of loss, courage, and the end of an era. Harold's story became foundational in the collective memory, influencing identity, kingship, and later interpretations of 1066. His brief reign, though overshadowed militarily, endured culturally. Harold II's image persisted through art and iconography. The Bayeux Tapestry, commissioned by Norman patrons, depicts him and Hastings with dramatic detail. Though created by the victors, the tapestry immortalized Harold as a recognizable figure, crown, helmet, and shield wall. Interestingly, English communities interpreted these images differently. Some saw tragedy, others saw heroism. Art became a tool for memory, a bridge between fact and legend. Beyond the tapestry, illustrations, carvings, and coins reflected shifting narratives of power. Harold's image symbolized both a lost Anglo-Saxon kingdom and the resilience of cultural memory. Visual representation reinforced identity, ensuring that even under Norman rule, the last native king remained part of England's story. Stories of Harold II thrived in villages and oral tradition long after his death. Minstrels, storytellers, and families recounted his bravery, strategic brilliance, and ultimate sacrifice. These legends were personal, community-centered, and often blended fact with imagination. They became moral tales, inspiring courage, loyalty, and resistance. Even under Norman rule, such stories offered a sense of continuity, a cultural thread connecting the past to the present. Memory became subtle defiance. While castles and sheriffs enforced authority, oral tradition preserved identity. Harold's shadow lingered in English consciousness, reminding future generations that England once had a king of its own. Monasteries played a crucial role in keeping Harold's memory alive. Monks copied chronicles, preserved genealogies, and taught young scribes. Religious instruction intertwined with historical memory, embedding stories of Harold in lessons about kingship, loyalty, and ethics. These centers of learning ensured that English identity endured within the constraints of Norman oversight. While monasteries adopted Norman administration and liturgy, they safeguarded Anglo-Saxon culture in texts, rituals, and oral practices. Harold II's story, preserved in this manner, became a foundation for future reflection on leadership, resistance, and national identity. Monks served as custodians of memory, bridging past and future while under foreign dominance. Harold II transformed from a historical figure into a symbol. For later generations, he represented the last independent Anglo-Saxon king, courage against overwhelming odds, and the fragility of human leadership in times of crisis. His legacy was complex, militarily defeated, politically overshadowed, yet culturally resilient. Songs, chronicles, art, and oral traditions reinforced his story across centuries. Harold became a cautionary tale about fate, leadership, and the consequences of divided support. Even under Norman rule, he shaped English identity. His reign, brief but defining, continued to influence perceptions of kingship, valor, and cultural continuity. For historians, Harold II embodies the tension between historical fact, legend, and memory, a king lost in battle but immortalized in narrative. After Hastings, William replaced local Anglo-Saxon governance with centralized Norman authority. Sheriffs, accountable directly to the crown, controlled taxation, law enforcement, and military organization. Castles symbolized constant oversight, physically and administratively dominating the landscape. Harold's England had relied on consensus, personal loyalty, and local knowledge. Now authority flowed top-down. Every decision, from land allocation to market regulation, was reported and scrutinized. Local English leaders became minor actors, their autonomy greatly diminished. This restructuring ensured obedience and stability. While harsh, it prevented rebellion from gaining momentum. Norman governance was methodical, using architecture, taxation, and military readiness to enforce rule. Harold's memory lingered, but the structures that had supported his kingship, regional networks, personal alliances, were largely gone. For the people, life became more predictable in some ways but less flexible. Daily survival required understanding the new hierarchy and compliance with distant authority. Land became the central instrument of control. Norman knights received estates confiscated from Anglo-Saxon nobles, creating a feudal hierarchy based on loyalty to the crown. Harold's approach, balancing local lordships and customary rights, was replaced with formalized tenure and obligations. Peasants and villagers worked the land under new masters, while Norman lords administered justice and collected taxes. The redistribution reshaped society. Wealth, influence, and military responsibility now depended on service to William rather than inherited local ties. Anglo-Saxon elites who survived had to navigate this new system or fade into irrelevance. This transformation was not only political but social. It established clear lines of authority, integrating law, military power, and economics under one ruler. England had become a kingdom where obedience and recorded obligations mattered more than tradition or personal loyalty. Law shifted alongside governance. Norman sheriffs presided over local courts, enforcing regulations derived from the crown rather than customary Anglo-Saxon practice. Fines, taxes, and punishments were standardized. Disputes that Harold might have mediated personally or through consensus now went through formalized courts. Clergy still played roles in moral guidance, but their influence was increasingly under Norman oversight. This system reduced localized violence and unpredictable feuds but introduced rigidity. Legal authority became an instrument of central power. The people had to adjust quickly, learning the rules, adhering to documentation, and accepting the authority of foreign officials. Harold's approach, flexible, consensus-driven, and locally grounded, was replaced by hierarchical enforcement. This transition illustrates the broader conquest, political, social, and cultural transformation, shaping England for generations. Norman consolidation relied on permanent military structures. Castles were garrisoned with trained knights ready to quell rebellion. Roads and borders were monitored, ensuring rapid response to unrest. Harold's England had mobilized warriors seasonally, relying on loyalty and the fiat system. Now, defense and deterrence were continuous. Peasants observed knights patrolling, and markets operated under the watch of soldiers. This constant military presence reinforced obedience and stability, but also reminded the population that conquest had imposed a new reality. Authority was tangible, disciplined, and unyielding. At the same time, this system allowed Norman rule to consolidate without frequent large-scale warfare. England's population adapted, learning that survival depended on compliance, adaptation, and quiet resilience, preserving identity and memory amidst structural domination. Despite the imposition of Norman rule, English culture persisted. Villages continued traditions, oral histories preserved memories of Harold II, and local practices subtly blended with Norman customs. Language shifted, French and Latin dominated official communication, but Old English survived in speech and private records. Festivals, craftwork, and storytelling adapted without disappearing. Harold's legacy became symbolic, teaching lessons of courage, loyalty, and resistance. This integration demonstrates resilience. While the conquerors imposed structures, the conquered maintained identity beneath the surface. England became a hybrid kingdom, combining Norman efficiency with Anglo-Saxon persistence. Harold II's reign may have ended abruptly, but his memory endured, shaping how English society remembered leadership, valor, and cultural continuity. Even under foreign dominance, identity persisted, quietly influencing generations of writers, chroniclers, and communities. Life for ordinary villagers changed subtly yet profoundly. Taxes were formalized, overseen by Norman sheriffs. Obligations once enforced by local thanes now came from distant authority. Farmers learned to navigate new expectations. Rents, labor duties, and obligations to Norman lords. Markets operated under surveillance, but trade and crafts continued, blending old practices with new regulations. Peasants adapted, preserving customary knowledge of seasons, harvests, and local rituals while complying with foreign oversight. Daily survival depended on pragmatism. Harold II's England, grounded in personal loyalty and communal negotiation, had vanished. Yet continuity persisted in rituals, oral traditions, and local customs, quietly defying the complete dominance of the conquerors. Religious life adapted under Norman rule. Parish churches persisted, monasteries remained centers of learning, and Christian festivals continued. Norman clergy emphasized centralized liturgy, but local communities retained customs, harvest celebrations, saints' days, and seasonal rituals blended English tradition with Norman structure. Monks and priests preserved stories of Harold II and pre-conquest life, embedding memory within faith. This integration provided stability. Villagers could participate in familiar practices while adhering to new authority. Harold's reign influenced these practices indirectly, as cultural memory shaped communal identity, morality, and celebration. England's spiritual landscape became a subtle blend of continuity and imposed change. Monasteries and abbeys continued to educate a new generation. Latin literacy expanded, religious instruction flourished, and scribes documented land, law, and tradition. Harold II's reign had emphasized local knowledge and oral memory. Under Norman oversight, these practices were formalized in texts, preserving English heritage while aligning with new governance. Children learned moral and practical lessons from clergy, often hearing stories of Harold's leadership, courage, and loss. Education became a bridge, connecting the past with a present defined by conquest and centralization. English culture endured through subtle, structured transmission, safeguarding identity within a transforming society. While most adapted, small acts of resistance persisted. Some nobles plotted rebellion, some villages delayed obligations, and rumors of Anglo-Saxon heroes circulated. These acts were rarely overt but carried symbolic weight. They reinforced communal memory, reminding the population that Harold II's England was not entirely erased. Adaptation and subtle defiance coexisted, compliance for survival, resistance for identity. This balance helped maintain English culture beneath the dominant Norman framework. Memory, local customs, and community networks preserved a sense of continuity, even as administrative structures, taxation, and military control enforced obedience. By this point, England had become a hybrid kingdom. Norman governance, military control, and land redistribution coexisted with enduring Anglo-Saxon customs, language, and memory. Markets, festivals, and local rituals blended elements of both cultures. Oral tradition preserved Harold II's legacy, instilling a shared identity that transcended conquest. This cultural fusion illustrates resilience. English society adapted, maintaining heritage while navigating imposed authority. Harold II's brief reign remained a symbolic anchor, influencing perceptions of leadership, bravery, and justice. The kingdom was transformed politically and militarily, yet socially and culturally, continuity persisted. Memory, adaptation, and daily life allowed England to endure and evolve under Norman domination. Under Norman rule, markets became tightly regulated hubs of economic activity. Sheriffs oversaw trade, ensuring taxes and tolls were collected, and fair measures were enforced. Local producers adapted, selling crops, livestock, and crafts while complying with formal obligations. Trade with continental Europe increased, introducing new goods, ideas, and techniques. Coinage became standardized, facilitating commerce and consolidating royal authority. Harold II's England had relied on local agreements and customary obligations. Now rules were written, recorded, and enforced centrally. Yet, villagers maintained traditional skills, seasonal rhythms, and trade networks. This coexistence of structure and continuity allowed the economy to flourish despite conquest, proving that adaptation could preserve daily life even under imposed authority. Norman administration introduced a hierarchical system where sheriffs and officials reported directly to the crown. Taxes, labor duties, and legal enforcement were systematically monitored. Local English leaders had limited power, often reduced to intermediaries between peasants and Norman authority. Harold's decentralized governance, which relied on trust, loyalty, and local knowledge, was replaced by written records and structured oversight. This system improved predictability, reducing disputes and localized unrest, but it required strict compliance. England became a state where centralized record-keeping and bureaucratic oversight dictated social and economic interactions. Norman law reshaped justice. Local courts were now presided over by sheriffs or appointed lords, emphasizing standardized procedures over customary law. Fines, taxes, and punishments were carefully recorded, creating predictability but limiting local flexibility. Clergy still provided moral guidance, but legal authority increasingly stemmed from the crown rather than community consensus. Harold II's approach, negotiation and personal mediation, had been replaced by codified law enforced from above. The transition minimized localized feuds, yet it also imposed external control, illustrating how conquest could consolidate power while transforming societal norms. Taxes became formalized, directly tied to documented land, livestock, and production. The Doomsday Survey underpinned this system, ensuring accuracy and fairness from the Crown's perspective. Peasants, freed from some arbitrary exactions, nonetheless faced consistent obligations. Resources, grain, timber, livestock, were accounted for and allocated, supporting both local needs and royal priorities. Harold II's England had operated on customary levies and negotiated contributions. The Norman system relied on documentation, hierarchy, and enforcement, demonstrating how conquest imposed efficiency and predictability on society while reshaping power dynamics. The economic transformation reinforced Norman authority. Structured taxation, regulated trade, and centralized administration strengthened the crown while maintaining social stability. Local communities retained familiar routines. Farming, crafting, and seasonal festivals continued, yet within new constraints. Harold II's England, which relied on tradition and loyalty, had given way to a state where rules and records defined interaction. The conquest reshaped society. Economic growth was now tied to compliance, central oversight, and integration with continental networks. Yet cultural resilience allowed communities to preserve identity, memory, and daily life. Harold's legacy survived subtly in these patterns, demonstrating that leadership and cultural memory endure beyond political defeat. After Hastings, Norman military strategy reshaped England. Castles were erected across key towns, serving as administrative hubs and defensive strongholds. Unlike Harold II's England, which relied on temporary levies and local thanes, Norman rule relied on permanent garrisons. Soldiers trained year-round, ready to respond to uprisings or external threats. Castles symbolized dominance, projecting authority physically across the landscape. This military infrastructure ensured the crown could maintain control without constant warfare, while villagers adjusted to the visible presence of knights and fortresses. Harold's strategies of loyalty and rapid mobilization were replaced by systematic deterrence, illustrating how conquest reshaped both power and daily life. Many English nobles were displaced after Hastings. Those who survived were often reduced to ceremonial roles or relocated under Norman oversight. Harold II's network of thanes, central to his governance, largely vanished. New Norman lords assumed control, bringing foreign customs, language, and law. Yet some Anglo-Saxon families adapted, learning the new hierarchy and maintaining minor influence. Their survival depended on compromise, aligning with Norman authority while preserving family identity. This transition illustrates the human impact of conquest. Power shifted, but memory, tradition, and influence persisted in subtle forms, providing continuity amid radical change. England's borders were monitored more rigorously than ever. Norman knights patrolled coastal towns, rivers, and roads to prevent Viking raids or English rebellion. Harold II's defensive network relied on seasonal levies and local militia. Now permanent soldiers ensured rapid response, with castles acting as command centers. Villagers lived under constant, yet efficient military oversight. This system reduced regional instability, allowed commerce to flourish safely, and reinforced Norman dominance. The English population adapted pragmatically, accepting this military presence while maintaining daily life, preserving Anglo-Saxon memory beneath the surface of imposed control. Even under strict military and administrative oversight, English communities preserved identity. Local customs, crafts, and oral traditions continued quietly, reinforcing a sense of belonging and continuity. Villagers adapted to Norman taxation, law, and military presence while keeping familiar rhythms, seasonal work, festivals, and religious practices. Oral memory of Harold II, stories of courage, leadership, and resistance, remained central to community identity, passed between generations. This resilience demonstrates a key truth. Conquest may alter politics and governance, but cultural memory and daily life endure. England's people maintained continuity, blending adaptation with preservation, keeping the memory of their last native king alive. By this point, Harold II had become more than a historical figure. He was a symbol. His death at Hastings marked the end of Anglo-Saxon rule, yet his memory shaped English identity for centuries. Chroniclers, bards, and artists preserved his story, emphasizing bravery, leadership, and tragic fate. Even under Norman dominance, his legacy provided a cultural anchor, reminding English communities of their heritage. The conquest transformed governance, military organization, and society, but Harold's symbolic presence endured. England evolved politically, yet socially and culturally, the influence of its last native king remained, quietly shaping identity, memory, and historical reflection for generations to come. Norman conquest transformed taxation. Sheriffs collected dues systematically, based on detailed surveys of land and resources. Peasants, who once contributed irregularly under local thanes, now provided fixed payments and labor. Harold II's England had depended on negotiation and personal obligation. The Normans relied on records and oversight. This consistency strengthened royal authority and funded castles, military campaigns, and administration. Despite the rigidity, villagers gradually adjusted, recognizing the predictability of obligations. Daily life continued with subtle adaptations. Harvests, markets, and festivals persisted, but within a formalized framework. Economic stability reinforced obedience, while also allowing communities to thrive under centralized structure. Harold's legacy survived indirectly through memories embedded in these communities, who adapted yet preserved cultural continuity. Norman lords received confiscated Anglo-Saxon estates. Land ownership became hierarchical, tied to service and loyalty to William. Local villagers adjusted to new landlords, while some surviving Anglo-Saxon nobles served as intermediaries. Harold II's network of personal allegiances was gone, replaced by formal obligations and written contracts. These changes reshaped social structure. Authority, justice, and economy flowed from Norman oversight, leaving little room for local autonomy. Yet traditions persisted quietly. Harvest techniques, festivals, and local knowledge survived within communities, blending with imposed governance. Courts became formalized, presided over by Norman officials. Local disputes, fines, and punishments followed centralized protocols. Harold II had relied on mediation, custom, and local consensus. The Normans emphasized documentation and hierarchy, reducing arbitrary judgments but limiting flexibility. Clergy maintained moral guidance but under oversight, ensuring alignment with central authority. This legal structure reinforced obedience while preserving some continuity in social norms. Villagers adapted to predictable enforcement, while oral memory of Harold II and pre-conquest law remained part of local consciousness. England now functioned under codified systems, merging conquest with cultural survival. Castles and garrisons maintained stability. Soldiers patrolled roads, rivers, and borders to prevent uprisings or Viking raids. Harold II's England had relied on seasonal levies and personal loyalty. Now, permanent forces ensured control. Military presence reassured Norman lords and enforced compliance, while villagers learned to coexist with knights and patrols. This system prevented major unrest, allowed trade to thrive safely, and symbolized Norman authority. Communities adapted, preserving memory and tradition while functioning under structured oversight. Harold II's influence remained symbolic, shaping cultural narratives even as governance transformed. Despite political transformation, English culture endured. Villages maintained rituals, seasonal celebrations, and oral traditions, blending Anglo-Saxon heritage with Norman structures. Harold II's reign became a reference point for courage and leadership, preserved in stories, chronicles, and memory. Education, religious practices, and community organization adapted, retaining continuity beneath new authority. This cultural resilience demonstrates that conquest can alter power structures without erasing identity. Daily life, social norms, and memory preserve the essence of Harold's England. The hybrid society, part Anglo-Saxon, part Norman, set the stage for England's evolving identity in the centuries to follow. Even decades after Hastings, Harold II remained a powerful symbol of Anglo-Saxon England. Chronicles, poems, and oral stories preserved his courage, leadership, and tragic fate. Villagers recounted tales of his valor, framing him as the last defender of a native kingdom. His story inspired resilience, teaching lessons about loyalty, bravery, and the consequences of political upheaval. Though Norman rule dominated politics, Harold's memory anchored English identity. It reminded communities of a past before conquest, providing continuity in cultural consciousness. Monks and chroniclers documented Harold's reign and the Battle of Hastings. Manuscripts recorded not just events but moral and symbolic lessons. Harold II's leadership, his decisions, and his tragic end became tools for teaching, remembrance, and cultural continuity. Stories emphasized honor and the cost of political miscalculation, reinforcing societal memory. Even under Norman authority, these texts preserved Anglo-Saxon perspectives, subtly influencing English historical consciousness. Harold II became a rallying symbol, not for immediate rebellion, but for identity. Communities referenced his story to preserve Anglo-Saxon language, traditions, and values. Even as obedience to Norman law and authority became essential, memory of Harold fostered pride and cultural cohesion. Stories of bravery in the face of overwhelming odds shaped the English understanding of kingship and honor. Harold's reign and death indirectly influenced future English military and religious practices. Strategic insights, battlefield valor, and ceremonial observances were remembered in both chronicles and local rituals. Normans learned from English defensive methods, integrating them into administration and garrison planning. Meanwhile, Anglo-Saxon moral and martial ideals continued to inspire local culture. Harold II's brief reign became a benchmark, defining leadership in courage, responsibility, and sacrifice. By now, Harold II's influence extended beyond politics into identity. Festivals, storytelling, and religious observances preserved Anglo-Saxon memory subtly under Norman dominance. Villagers continued traditions, children learned tales of valor, and local institutions adapted, blending old and new. Harold's story served as both cautionary tale and source of inspiration. This cultural continuity demonstrates resilience. Conquest altered power but could not erase memory. Harold II became more than a king. He was a symbol of enduring identity, bridging past and future. Harold II's brief reign left an indelible mark on England. Though his life ended at Hastings, his leadership, courage, and strategic vision remained a touchstone for cultural memory. He represented the final chapter of native Anglo-Saxon kingship, a ruler whose decisions shaped the fate of the kingdom. Chroniclers preserved his story not only for historical record, but as a moral and symbolic example for future generations. Even under Norman dominance, his image inspired narratives of loyalty, resilience, and heroism. Communities remembered him as a figure who stood at the crossroads of tradition and transformation, embodying both the strengths and vulnerabilities of Anglo-Saxon England. Harold's reign and the Battle of Hastings shaped the evolution of English national identity. While Norman rule imposed foreign governance, the memory of Harold II provided a cultural anchor. Stories of his valor and tragic fate became symbols of resilience, loyalty, and communal memory. They influenced literature, oral tradition, and the emerging sense of English identity that blended Anglo-Saxon heritage with new Norman structures. His legacy reminded successive generations of the cost of leadership, the fragility of power, and the enduring influence of cultural memory. Harold II's reign, though short, became a reference point for what it meant to lead, fight, and preserve identity amid upheaval. Harold II's decisions offer insights into leadership under pressure. He balanced diplomacy, military readiness, and internal governance to preserve his kingdom. While ultimately overpowered at Hastings, his strategies reflected an understanding of alliances, timing, and resource management. Scholars and chroniclers emphasize that his failures and successes shaped English military and political thought. Even centuries later, his reign serves as a study in leadership under extreme conditions, teaching lessons about foresight, loyalty, and adaptation. Despite conquest, social and cultural life persisted. Villagers maintained traditions, crafts, and religious practices, blending Anglo-Saxon and Norman influences. Harold II's reign remained alive in memory, guiding moral, cultural, and social behavior. Stories of his leadership were passed down, festivals and oral traditions continued, and education in monasteries preserved both knowledge and identity. This continuity illustrates resilience. Conquest may change rulers, but culture and memory endure, shaping the evolution of society over generations. Harold's legacy became woven into the social fabric of England, influencing identity, values, and collective consciousness long after his death. Harold II's life and reign, though brief, left an enduring imprint on England. He was the last Anglo-Saxon king, whose courage and leadership became a symbol of resistance, identity, and cultural memory. The political landscape transformed under Norman rule, yet his story remained a moral compass and a bridge between past and future. England's people adapted to new governance while preserving traditions, festivals, and oral history. Harold II's legacy demonstrates that leadership, memory, and cultural identity can survive even after military defeat. His reign reminds us that history is not just about conquest, but about the endurance of human values, cultural continuity, and the stories we carry forward.